Welcome to Belong. I'm Kevin Michelizzi, and I'm excited to share with you my conversation with Kim Larson from Luminoso. Earlier this year, Kim and I had a chance to work together to better understand the needs of my neighborhood. I know many of us don't think of data when we think of cultivating belonging, but having the right insights makes a huge difference. I hope you enjoy our chat as much as I have. I'm super excited to be chatting with you because you and I have worked closely together on a survey for my neighborhood. I know you do a lot for your neighborhood, and just so excited to have you on the show. One of the things I think people listening won't know is that you've got a bachelor's in economics and a master's in data science.
Almost. Just started the data science
Oh, got
program.
it.
Learning as we
Got it.
go.
Got it. So working towards your master's in data science,
Yes,
but still
yes.
a very different background than you'd expect for someone who works with communities.
That's so that is disappointing because you would hope that folks working with communities would have an understanding of, like, the incentives and the economics and, like, be data
Right.
driven, but that's part of why I pursued it. I think I started community first and then wanted to assess how to do it well, which is how I ended up with the econ and data science background.
What did that journey look like?
Initially, when I was in high school, I did a lot of volunteering. So that was back during the Invisible Children and Darfur genocide era. And so I had a really strong passion around like just wanting to make things better.
Right.
So initially, I started off studying nonprofit
Okay.
business. And then the more I learned about the challenges nonprofits face, the more I was like, no, it's this, there's systemic issues that need to be addressed. Let's understand those better. Let's be good at that. So, in my econ background, I got a science degree in economics, an arts degree in international studies, and minors in math and business. And part of a developmental economic focus included studying abroad. So, I lived in Uganda for a while and studied the effects of pollution on development in Kampala. And then I came back and finished my degree. Ended up going into the experience management space. So, working with hospitality surveys and employee surveys, which is still using data to make people's lives better.
Right.
Like, if you've ever had a miserable boss, you recognize how important it is
Where you
to,
rage type as you respond to the survey?
yeah, for my last email. Yeah. Because those frictions add up to quality of life
Oh,
over
totally.
time. And so, kind of building my credentials there, I moved into focusing just on text analytics, where I'm currently at Luminoso, and that kind of snowballed into uh, showing up at the neighborhood association meeting on election night, and they were like, "Who's going to run for the board?" I'm like, "I guess I'm qualified to do that." So I accidentally joined the neighborhood association board. And the question kind of came up of like, how do we decide what we prioritize
Right.
as a neighborhood association? And the feedback was a general, well, people tell us, and then we do that. And being more of a introverted by default person, like I didn't intend to run for the board. I just kind of fell into
Right.
it. I recognize that there's probably a large portion of our neighborhood that isn't going to show up, that isn't going to speak up, but their experiences are still very
Right.
important, at least to me. So that's how we started the neighborhood survey. Initially, we didn't expect it to become as popular as it was. Like we got 800 respondents turning in surveys. The survey was open from November through April
Okay.
ish. And it turns out when you have that much data with the kind of surveys and stories that we collected, it ends up being a bigger deal than we initially anticipated, which I think is probably what got your attention for our neighborhood was, oops, we figured out a thing.
Right. Well, I mean, we had done a, my uh, Arbor Lodge Neighborhood Association board journey went the exact same way yours did. I was at the meeting on election night, and one of my neighbors nominated me, and I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it." So I do primarily communications for them, but I was finding the same problem. Like, how do you know? I mean, the few folks that are incredibly vocal are usually on some extreme, and they don't necessarily represent everyone in the neighborhood. But how do you figure out, what that is? So the first year I, threw together a Google form. We got like 100 and I think like 110 people to respond, and I was super excited because, I think the themes I saw were similar to what I expected.
Mhm.
But then when you and I started working together, there were just a whole series of questions. I know in terms of my survey, I was going for quantitative because
Mhm.
any open-ended question I asked, I was the one reading through everyone and trying to figure out, "Okay, how do I categorize this?" Like,
Yeah.
I mean, literally spent hours trying to crunch those numbers and get a better picture to present back to the neighborhood and to the board.
Mhm.
Whereas, bringing in a technology like yours was like, "Oh, okay, let's ask as many open-ended questions as we can." I mean, if people are
Yeah.
willing to share, I would much rather capture their stories, and I've heard you use the term "storyful" a lot.
Yes.
Is that kinda central to your thinking when it
It
comes to,
absolutely is.
especially to surveying?
Yeah, so first I wanna validate your approach prior, because the first week of grad school, the professor's like, "When you're designing a research study, these are the forms of bias that you can have, and the recommendation is to avoid open-ended surveys, like, lean into the quant." And I was like, "No." Right? 'Cause it's built off of this presumption of the technology
Right.
available, and what I do for work. So a little bit about what I do with Luminoso and why this became an option at all. Luminoso is a company that spun out of the MIT Media Lab as a PhD research
Okay.
thesis on how can computers can they understand language like a human does. And the way humans learn language, when you think about infants and even dogs to some degree, there's this immersive experience for language where they are based on the context of what words are used when you realize, like, oh, put on your shoes equals we're going for a walk. There's these context clues. And it's usually they're strung together in a string, right? So the technology, what the computers end up doing with Daylight is the text analytics product. It looks for words used synonymously or in conjunction with each other. So for St. John's, it was able to determine the difference between Lombard House, a very beloved bar, and Lombard, the
Right.
street. Lombard House is right across from Beer Porch. There's food carts. They're both very recommended. There's some clientele overlap. So, one of the questions in the survey that both Arbor Lodge and St. John's asked was, what advice would you give to a new neighbor? Things they should try, things they should do, things they should avoid. And it turns out the restaurants and coffee shops that people gravitate to have demographic clustering. So the folks who go to some dive bars will mention similar locations, whereas some who go to like Cathedral Coffee on Willamette, they're going to different coffee shops than the folks who go to 48 North or Daydreamer or all these local businesses that we
Right.
have. So, what our technology allows us to do is we have to get this storyful data. We need folks to be describing it as they would be explaining it to a peer or a neighbor, someone new. And that gives the AI the context that it needs to surface, like, oh, Fessenden has these connotations, Lombard has these connotations. Where do we need crosswalks? Where do we need, like, do we need police? Turns out that's a very polarizing topic in St. John's. Whereas, and maybe we'll get to this later, there was an event during the survey period where the neighborhood found out on February 28th, after the survey was supposed to be closed, that there was going to be a bottle drop, that they purchased the Dollar Tree location, and there was like an NDA, so we didn't know about it. And we're like, why did you buy it for over asking? Like red flags went up and across the neighborhood. And I checked with one of our like local community organizers and like, what do we do? There's this all this news and people have big feelings about
Right.
this. And the advice was close the SERP, preserve the data as it is. And I was like, that doesn't, I don't want to mute people's voices
Nope.
that way. Right? Like people need an outlet. We have a channel or a forum for that to be siphoned into. And it turned out to be really good for the survey data because it solidified by increasing the volume, the existing narratives. And there was really only one question in the entire 10 essay question survey that really changed. And it didn't change as much as gain focus. We can probably talk about that in a little bit if we want to go through what was in this survey and
Yeah,
why.
I would
Because,
actually love to. I mean, obviously, I'm pretty familiar with it, both yours
yeah,
and the one we ran for my neighborhood. But yeah,
yeah,
when we're talking about creating a sense of belonging, I think a lot of people focus on your behaviors, your approach, even your mental state. You know, are you approaching everything with empathy? And I think very few people think about it in terms of how can we use data to better understand and therefore do the right things for that community or for others to feel like they belong. So yeah, I would
yeah.
love to dig into it if you'd like.
Okay. So we're about to get into a pretty long segment as I take us kind of page by page through the survey. The first part of the survey is the introduction. And the goal for this section is for folks to identify their their opinion being valid. And there's a hypothesis that it's one of my hypotheses. It may be proven. I still need to dig into it. But when people feel like they're taking the survey on behalf of their community, they may take it a bit more seriously than if they feel like an individual or a number,
Interesting. Okay.
right? So we have them pick their geographical zone. So I split St. John's into 5 zones based on significant roadways. Because sometimes if it sucks to cross the street, you make your dog walk loop within the contained easy
Right.
zone, and that creates these interesting subgeographies within the community. So I split it into 5 based on what those significant roadways were and move forward from there. We also asked how long they've been in the community. We had it broken out into less than 12 months. Do you know the neighborhood as it is? 1 to 5 years. Are most of your memories here pandemic related and influenced by not starting with block parties and kind of figuring it out as we go? Folks who've been here 5 to 15 years. So, do you have a solid memory pre pandemic? And then you saw the events stop, you saw businesses closed, and then like are those your primary memories? And folks who'd been here 15 years or more, one of our surveys talked about how we needed an arcade where the old Blockbuster used to be. I remember Blockbuster. I don't know where the Blockbuster in St. John's was. So we had to do some like community archaeology and figure out like where was it? Because that level of experience
Right.
matters, right? Because some people raise their kids here, some people raise like their grandkids here. Like there's some generational families in our neighborhood. And we want to get a sense of where were those located? How many of those do we have left? How do we make sure that we're getting enough new people? Because if people have only moved in here last month, they're like, I don't have enough experience to tell you about anything here. I'm going to skip it. I don't feel like I've opted in enough. And recognizing that, we're like, okay, so maybe we need to approach some of these new high rise apartments and be like, hey, can your community members, can you help us kind of solicit their feedback? It is a benefit to the apartment complexes to have residents who are attached to the
Right.
neighborhood because they're more likely to renew the lease. And it's helpful for the neighborhood to be like, these are our neighbors. Like when we're out walking the dog, this is who we're going to see. This is who our friends are. If there's an emergency, and in St. John's case, we always talk about the bridges collapsing because the cut is a very big divide between us and the rest of North Portland.
Yep.
Who is going to be our emergency services? Our neighbors are going to be the emergency services. Let's get to know them. So there's page 1. We also had a shout out section, which told us like if you took the survey on behalf of someone. So that's where we found out how effective our flyers were, our newsletters were, Instagram, QR codes, local newspapers, and then we could redistribute the surveys back out to those entities.
Right.
So we presented it in the neighborhood. We shared the results with the local newspaper. We shared the results as broadly as we can and continuing to do so today. So if you want to see the St. John's neighborhood data, I'd say luminoso.com/SJNA-study.
I'll add
And
it
you can
to
look at the
the,
survey.
podcast episode notes as well.
Cool. Yeah. So you can click on that link and see the survey design. We go through quite a few of these events. And if you want to see the actual feedback yourself, I'm happy to pass that along because it's one of my core survey philosophies is this data collected should not be archived exclusively. Something should come from it. And as a community organizer, I don't know who can do something about
Right.
it. One of the things that came up in my survey and the Arbor Lodge one was like Trader Joe's. 'Cause we want like affordable food options in addition to grocery outlet and Safeway because it's a different shopping experience. Like Trader Joe's is pretty unique. Where else are you gonna get the weird cookie butter Trader Joe's stuff, right? You have to go to
Totally.
Trader Joe's for that. And St. John's kind of wants that too. So there's page 1 of the survey. Page 2, much shorter. That was what drew you to, in our case, St. John's in the first place and what keeps you here, or what drew you to Arbor Lodge in the first place and what keeps you here. From a marketing perspective, this would be our strengths. What did our PR say that got us connected, right? Like what had us hit the buy link? And it was pretty similar between Arbor Lodge and St. John's. Affordability, walkability, these are the strengths that kind of like drew. And there were some unique things too, like what we wanted to walk
Right.
to, slightly different. St. John's, tap houses and coffee. We just want to drink our calories.
You also have
Right.
far more businesses because you're in a
Yes.
larger neighborhood. Yeah.
Right. Right. Whereas walkability in Arbor Lodge to
Yep.
the park. We want to go see the trees. It's like they called it Arbor Lodge for a reason.
The
Um,
trees and one of the only accessible playgrounds in the city,
I
Harper's Playground.
Yeah, your park is very popular. So it would be really one of my like passion ideas. It's like, oh, I really wish I could get all this neighborhood data for all of Portland and outside of Portland. There's a community up in Saskatchewan, too small to qualify as a town. They are a hamlet.
I love it.
And I would love to see their feedback on this because they're not working. Like affordability might be huge, but walkability, I don't think would make the list at all because it's super
Right.
rural, right? Like you need to get in your truck to go to the gas station or to get food, or, there's more of a homesteading vibe. Also, the relationship with guns in that neighborhood. St. John's, if you go through the neighborhood data, you will see that we are a city neighborhood with city challenges as it relates to gun issues. Up in Lumsden, it's because you had to shoot the bear because they were harassing the horses. Like that's not going to be
Right.
the case in St.
Right.
John's. So yeah, why did you choose the community and what keeps you here? That's our strengths. After that, we had the let's see. I have it pulled up because I was working with someone on it earlier today. All right, so the next section was on defining livability. So the neighborhood association charters, and for I think a lot of the city, it's to improve livability. What does that mean?
That's such a common word with such a vague meaning for, like, local
Yeah, like
governments, nonprofits. Yeah.
it's like, well, it improves how well like how well you live there, and how people want to define their lives is completely
Right.
personal. So, is livability the feeling of community, connection, access, commerce, economics plays a huge part of that. And so, to have an understanding of how do we improve something that we can't define or measure, that's not good goal
Right.
metrics, right? You're supposed to make smart goals. You got to be able to define it. So, yeah, what does livability mean to you? And that could allow us to define like what are we prioritizing safety in terms of curb cuts, in terms of lighting, or are we improving safety in terms of connection, exchanging phone numbers? If there's an earthquake or the volcanoes explode, what is
Right.
livability? Right? Like we just talked about gun violence, like that is a thing that does, potentially threaten people's quality of life and the livability of the neighborhood. For some folks, it's like, I need access to restaurants and entertainment and things that make me want to feel alive
Right.
here. I need a place to send my kids and to do things with them and build childhood memories. Arbor Lodge had some really cute teach my kids how to ride a bike. St. John's that didn't come through in the same
Right.
way. You guys have much more of like a family core, which is really wholesome to see. All the surveys that we look through, I'm always like, I'm gonna cry. And training my kid or teaching my kids how to ride a bike, different reasons to cry than maybe some of my St. John
Right.
stuff. And then there were two questions about change management. So generally in survey design, most of the questions I tend to work with for the storyful categories fall into reflective, projective, and hypothesis or change management. So people generally have a, a degree of comfort that is likely different between how vulnerable do they feel safe being, how confident are they to tell other people what to do, and then change management is allowing us to do some hypothesis testing on like what changes would improve, make things worse, what are the consequences of those should be evaluated. So if you think of reflective, that's often like your CSAT or your 5-star rating after an online
Right.
purchase. Reflective, you are looking at how did the experience relate to the expectations? That's your satisfaction. The projection is your NPS stuff, your advice stuff. What would you recommend someone else do? There may be a gender split regarding who feels comfortable being vulnerable and reflecting and who feels confident telling other people what to do. But we offer both because both are very important to
Right.
capture. And then change management tells us, would adding police make things better or worse? Some people are like, yeah, we need someone to crack down on this gun violence and car racing and donuts happening at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Like it's unsafe. We need to stop this and do a crackdown. And other people are bringing up like there's other solutions.
Right.
Like, yes, that's a problem, but police is a solution that may make things worse. What if we tried for more green infrastructure, speed bumps? Let's get more creative and let's find out what do we have consensus on and where do we have polarization on? Where are we drawn to the two ends? So we have a changes for better and a changes for worse question. Changes for worse is really hard for folks
Right.
generally, right? Because they're like, I don't know, it hasn't happened yet. What are you planning? So that one can be a little bit tricky. For St. John's, the bottle drop really distilled. We had some loose themes about like, well, if there was an increase in unhoused population, or if more of our businesses closed, those would be changes that would make the neighborhood worse. And then when the bottle drop topic was introduced, they're like, the bottle drop would make things worse because of exactly those reasons. We'd get more car traffic, which would be worse. We would have more folks who are unemployed hanging out, worried about economic issues, make things worse. And so that kind of distilled everything together for us. Any questions on the stuff we've covered so far? Other contributions to those 3 pages?
No, no. I really liked the change for better and change for worse questions because it's not something I think we intuitively think to ask. And by asking it, we got such a wide variety of answers that I don't think would have come out in any other questions. And you always end with like the open-ended, anything else you want to tell us, but like unless you're guiding their thinking on it, you're really not gonna get to that.
No, it's tough brainstorming to navigate. And one of I have found that the more novel or interesting the survey design is, the more people want to reciprocate that experience. And they really did feel heard. I felt surprised and validated that folks were writing 6-paragraph essays on the change for worse
Right.
question and 6-paragraph. I'm like, how many thousands of hours did the community invest in this question just because we asked good
Yep.
questions? One of the things that I've learned from my clients here at Luminoso is we tend to perform best in applications where people are familiar with focus group methodology and you need to flesh out a full discussion guide. What this survey design allowed us to do is do that focus group qualitative research at a quantitative
Right.
scale. And it was a lot to go through, but I kind of cheated with using the platform because it lets us
Well, it's not
upload.
really cheating if you have a
Yeah.
technology that is designed for this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true, and it let us get into some really deep stuff. Like the next section, there's that was my smooth transition sentence. The next section was about my hypothesis that connection displaces fear. So the more connected folks feel, the less likely they are to create caricatures of other groups and take more of a community minded approach to problem solving compared to seeking out levels of like adversive approach
Okay.
solutions. So, like, inviting a police force would be a last resort. There's a problem. We should lock people away, right? So I wanted to find out, well, how connected do we feel and how do we start to flesh that out as it compares to changes for better, changes for worse, that kind of thing, right? Because if you're at wit's end, you're like, just make the pain
Right.
stop. So we have this connection question on, not connected at all to extremely connected. And then the question was describe the events and locations that have helped you feel most connected to the community and why, what makes them so special and effective. And that had a good distribution of, folks who walk their dogs. They see the same people at the dog park every day, or PTA, or volunteering, or being regulars at a coffee shop or a bar. And it was an interesting distribution on this, like, how connected do you feel scaled
Okay.
question to the open end. Interestingly, Arbor Lodge, people who felt connected via the newsletter. In St. John's, people who felt less connected, their gateway into the community was block parties because it brought the community to them instead of having to go outreach to the community. People who volunteer, much more connected than people who didn't mention
Right.
volunteering. The farmers market is a very popular way of connecting with folks in St. John's. So that was a high volume towards the average. Did you find anything in your connection question that kind of resonated or?
The responses were, I think, along the lines of what I was expecting. I think what fascinated me the most was the differences based on which part of the neighborhood you're in all the responses. I think in part because we just have two commercial corridors, two major roads that kind of buffer, or not really buffer because one does cut through the neighborhood, but just looking at those, the experiences and the challenges are entirely different or perceived differently for them than if you go 4 blocks closer to the park.
We had that with
Yeah.
Fessenden. So, folks north of Fessenden, which is a part of the neighborhood that is not covered by some of the grant writing, like small business assistance, doesn't extend as far as Fessenden.
Okay.
It only goes along Lombard. And so, as a consequence of that, there are few active businesses on Fessenden compared to Lombard, where there are
Right.
dozens. So in this connection question, the folks north of Fessenden, they had Daydreamer. Like, that is their go-to business that responded to the survey. There are more businesses over there, but they weren't surfaced in the survey in the same way. Whereas folks who were south of Lombard along the bridge in the Cathedral Park area, variety of more businesses were mentioned. There were more niches. It was just interesting. And the advice that people gave for advice to new neighbor also had some really stark geographical breakdowns. So we had some questions about downtown, about how people usually get around and how they would like to get
Right.
around. That one was, maybe it's because it wasn't particularly storyful. It didn't seem to have the same kind of grasp. We have the question on, if there were decreased car traffic on Lombard, how much time would you spend in the district? And either they would spend less time with less traffic or they would spend more time with more traffic. That had an interesting kind of correlation with how they felt about the state of the neighborhood today. If they felt positive about the state of the neighborhood today, they would spend more time with less traffic, probably because they're walking
Right.
around. I say probably because I haven't looked into it, but it's a hypothesis, right? And then I was surprised that folks would spend less time downtown if like at all. Like, what do you mean if there was fewer cars, you would spend less time there? I looked into those surveys and they had feedback kind of with the assumption of if there are fewer cars, that means there'd be fewer people because it would be less safe,
Oh, okay.
right? This perception that car traffic equals popularity equals safety.
Yeah.
So it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
that's something you see, like, it's incredibly common here in Portland. The no cars, everybody bikes and
mhm,
walks camp versus the, "Oh my gosh, we still need cars, and we need more parking, we need more access." So, it wouldn't have
mhm.
surprised me if some of those folks who were like, "Oh, yeah, if there were less cars down there," they're thinking also it's gonna be harder to get to. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting to see how folks perceive that, and I would love to get this information in front of PBOT, for example, so we could look into those folks who said I would spend less time if there was less car
right,
traffic, because the less car traffic doesn't mean less parking. It could just mean more bike parking so that there is more space for folks to park their bikes. So maybe there's more parking spaces available because people biked instead of drove. You now have fewer people to compete for spots with. We have the data. We're happy to share
yeah,
it. Just to see, because I've noticed I bike to downtown St. John's more than I drive since I can. And there's been times where I'm like, there's nowhere to park my bike. What a Portland
right,
problem to have like all the bike parking taken. You have to take it like a few more businesses down. You're like, well, now I can't keep an eye on my bike and I like my bike.
right.
I don't want it to get stolen.
Yeah, and it's tough because where I live, my neighborhood has a light rail that comes right up
Mhm,
through it. I can also walk less than a block, hop on a bus, and go straight up to downtown St. John's, and I have to
mhm.
admit, I have never taken the bus up there. Like, we will drive up there.
Yeah,
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 fascinating.
that doesn't surprise me at
Yeah,
all. Because the bus, I I live between 2 bus lines. I can go 2 blocks to catch the bus on Fessenden. I can go 2 blocks, catch the bus on Lombard. I either bike or
right,
drive, and the smooth you guys have a max line. St. John's, one of the things the next question on the survey was, "What is St. John's missing? Be specific." And that has a preface of explain why St. John's needs it, where it is needed, and examples of similar things so that we can compare, right? Like, because you may say, like, we're missing a pedestrian island or bike safety or bike infrastructure. Point out where you're thinking of, because green paint is different from physical barriers, is different from bike only
right,
lanes. What do you mean by bike infrastructure? And in the what is St. John's missing section, people brought up the frog ferry, which and people also brought up the max. Like there people want a way to get downtown. One of the reasons I don't take the bus is because I was gonna go there for I had a race. So I did the half
Oh, good
marathon
for you.
on Sunday. Thanks. And recognizing like all of downtown was gonna be locked off, no cars. A similar situation for Pride,
Right,
right? There's just no way to get downtown. And so I was like, okay, well, public transportation goes right by where I need to be. And taking public transit was going to take
right.
an hour, 20 minutes, or it's a 15-minute car ride. When I have to be there at 6:30 a.m., I'm not taking them. I'm not getting up at 4.
Yeah,
No.
no, definitely
So
not. Definitely
So
not.
the frog fairy was something that was mentioned, and in the what is missing question, I think we've explored that question more than anything else in the survey because there was such a broad economic
Right,
impact, because it's surfacing problems. So previously we talked about changes for better, changes for worse. What is missing is a very explicit question that they have long laundry lists of we're missing a crosswalk here, we're missing paint here, we're missing a dry cleaner, we're missing ice cream, we're missing frog fairy, like a whole bunch of topics. And the survey hadn't even closed yet. So we opened it in November. We got some early feedback, and people said, like, we're missing ice cream. I'm like, it's 20 degrees outside. What do you mean we're missing ice cream? And Wonderwood, Mike Bennett's little installation on Lombard that is increasingly beloved because he's making such a big splash. He added a soft serve machine in December because I was still trying to get people to promote the survey taking.
Right.
And we had some initial feedback. I'm like, it's going to be good. And Mike's like, already on it. Soft serve machine introduced. And he added this cute little, like, there's the Wonderwood sign out front. And he did a little chain thing to ice cream hanging from it to show, like, we have ice cream. Good job,
I
Mike.
love it.
Um, so it had such an immediate
Right,
impact. Mosaic down the street, it's another tap house. For a limited time, they had beer inspired ice cream. So chocolate in honor of a stout, like a fruity flavor in honor of the hazy. It's not beer derived ice cream, but inspired ice
right,
cream. So they had a little bit of a seasonal thing there. We have a lot of big companies in Portland that can afford this market research. The small local businesses that we want to support in our neighborhoods, they often need to be equipped with data to build confidence to know that they're meeting a need in order to do it, right? Like, because they're listening to customer feedback. They're doing the same thing that our local neighborhood associations are doing. Like, oh yeah, if you tell us, we'll go do it. It's like, well, can we equip them with feasibility studies that help
right,
everyone, right? When we go back to share that, because I personally don't want to take a survey for the 200 businesses in St. John's.
right.
But if I can take one survey and it can fuel the economy for the next 2 to 5 years, let's do that.
Yeah. Well, what would you have done differently with the survey or, thinking ahead, if you do this again
Mhm.
in a year or 2, like, what would you change?
Yeah, so the first thing we actually have a webinar coming up on this. One of the things that I missed, because I didn't think the survey would be as successful as it was demographic information. So when we go to Prosper Portland, we're like, "Okay, we need bike parking in these things." And their priority is based on DEI initiatives, so diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. They're like, well, is this serving the BIPOC community? Is this serving underserved communities, or is this further amplifying the privilege because they took the survey, they had a mobile phone, they had the extra time, and I didn't feel
Right.
equipped to ask the demographic information like race, ethnicity, gender, income, because there's some loaded economics and incentives behind
Right.
it, right? So I wish I had added that, and I've done more research since the survey to figure out how I could do that better. So next time I would add those demographic questions to the end, non-exclusive options with gender, because Portland has a comfort with a more wider variety of
Yeah,
genders than say Lumsden, right? Yeah, so I would include those at the end because the core of what we looked at was
right.
solid, right? Like when we asked about how they feel about St. John's today, there was that emotion grid that we included in St. John's. We didn't include for Arbor Lodge. I would include the emotion grid in future iterations because it added such diversity to like show like no, we're not just getting the angry folks and the excited folks. We got folks who felt complacent or sad or had general medium feelings. That was really
We
good. We
did
just needed to figure out.
we did that question.
We You had the
Right.
scales, but the image, the 100 point
Oh, right. Right. Yep.
feelings grid. So for the audience, because we kind of just like glossed over that, if you look up the emotion grid, it equips them with emotions like enraged, panic, stressed, jittery, livid, furious, frustrated. That's in the angry quadrant. And they can start to map like how high of an energy feeling do I have? And then they can figure out how to navigate from there of like, do I need to decrease my emotions, increase the pleasantness by what spectrum? Okay, let's do a dance party, get the energy out, and we'll feel
Right.
better. And what that does is that helps equip respondents with the vocabulary for their experience. Some folks, they say, "How are you doing?" And they say, "Good, bad." That's not specific
Right.
enough for the research we want to do. So we have them kind of identify what their feelings are in the survey. And that showed us how diverse of a experience our community is offering. But yeah, What would I do differently? I would include that image. I'd include demographic questions.
Got it.
Those are my two things.
Got it. So one thing I wanted to make sure we carve out time to talk about is when we're talking about AI, I think there is, a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's a given.
Invalid.
But I also feel like, especially experiences we've had with just people in general with the tools that are available to us, is that it doesn't understand context. It misses
Hmm.
social cues. Like, it doesn't look at a question like we would, like humans would.
Mhm.
Gen AI is really looking for, patterns and probability. And
Mhm.
I think my big question for you, like as somebody working in the space and using the technology to help improve your neighborhood and your community, how do you keep the human factor in all of this?
Yeah. So first, I would say they are not exclusive. They're supplementary to each other, right? A lot of the shortcomings with AI are rooted in human feelings of insecurity or
Right,
safety. So one of the things that we would say we don't want to put through either our text analytics engine or in general, because it's really tough to detect, sarcasm is a context dependent
right,
thing, right? A lot of humans are also not good at sarcasm. Like we get an autism diagnosis when we're not good at sarcasm because there's context outside of what is said. Sarcasm happens when people don't feel safe. And so building things that build trust, having those human connections helps preserve the quality of the information we're given. So keep having the human conversations and then utilize the technology to empower that at scale, right? Because people do what works. So if they open up and they are not rewarded for it, they'll retreat. It's work to open
right,
up, right? They'll scale back. So what that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the survey is you were vulnerable enough to tell us about your police trauma of the day after Christmas in front of Thai Cottage. How do we respect that and bring it back to you as like how do we help foster that
right,
healing when people are rewarded for being vulnerable and being thoughtful and like I spent all this time taking the survey and saying I need ice cream and then I got ice cream. Okay, they have been validated for that
right,
integrity. So we're not automating any of the outputs, right? We're just automating the processing that allows us to ask those questions at scale. Ideally, the technology would foster more connection because we can add this line of you're not
right,
alone, right? Like you're frustrated with not having a place to hang out with your kids on weekends. You're not
right,
alone. Let's go find a solution. You are frustrated with car traffic. You're not alone. You want frog fairy. You're not alone. Because we shouldn't be covering our ears to the reality of people's experiences just because we don't think we have the time or bandwidth to
right.
ask. So I think that is it's a big yes and.
I love it. I love it. So we're kind of coming up towards time. We've talked a lot about the surveys that were done. For those listening who have a passion for building community, better understanding their communities, what advice would you give for how to get started doing this and how to get started really quantifying the needs of your community?
Yeah. So I think the first step is always have an objective and evaluate the resources you have available because there may not be perfect alignment. Like, I want to improve communities across the US. I don't have relationships across the
Right.
US, right? I got them within my little radius of St. John's. So understand your objectives and like who your stakeholders are, right? I want my neighbors to benefit. I want my local businesses to benefit. Okay, so that's going to limit some of the questions we may or may not ask. Then I'd say start fostering that community because we could not have done the survey without the support from our local businesses hanging our QR codes on their tables,
Right.
without the support of like the local newspapers putting those QR codes in to reach a demographic that we may not have reached otherwise. And then let's say work on asking thoughtful questions and test it on someone who doesn't have the time, right? Because they will tell you the shortest way to answer the question. If they can answer with a yes, no when you wanted a story, you probably need to work on how you ask the
Right.
question. And yeah, we'll figure things out from there.
I love that. Test it on someone who doesn't have the time
Or interns
or interns.
or the CEO. There's so many folks who just don't have the
Right.
time. Because there's some questions that, like, how will you remember St. John's in 5 to 10 years? That's not a yes no
Right.
question.
Right, and some people don't think long term, so you really have to pause
Mhm.
and spend some time on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's worth it.
Yeah, oh, agreed, agreed. I love the fact that we have a better understanding of the perspectives across our communities. So for any Portland neighborhoods listening who want to do this as well, it would be awesome to be able to actually analyze that data across the entire city.
Yeah, compare Lombard to 82nd. I wanna get the data from out in 82nd.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting because we have as much diversity in Portland as we do across the
yep,
US.
agreed.
Yep.
Alright, anything I didn't think of asking you that you were hoping I would?
No, I came in here as a blank slate. I just if people wanna see more of the data, obviously, and we also have a webinar coming up, so that'll be released on the Luminoso YouTube page if folks wanna catch up on how I might actually redesign the
Totally,
survey for
and the webinar will likely actually happen before this episode goes live, so we can
yeah.
include a link to the video
Cool.
in the, show notes.
Perfect.
Awesome. Kim, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me,
I
Kevin.
love doing this.